I thank overall my friend Peter and Sanya, and I thank all you to be there. So, the dispositive of person, if the point of philosophical reflection is to critically dismantle contemporary opinion, to radically interrogate what is presented as immediately clear to all, there are few concepts so in need of dismantling of that of person. No term in the Western tradition enjoys the wide-ranging success that the term person does today. I am talking not only about those areas directly related to it that run from philosophy to law to anthropology to finally theology, but also about those ideological perspectives that seem opposed to each other, like Catholic and secularist bioethics. While for Catholics a living being is to be considered a person since the moment of conception, for secularists it is much later. But however, both agree on the value that is to be attributed to the title of person. For both, the personalization is the crucial passage through which a biological material that lacks meaning becomes something intangible. Only a life that has crossed beforehand through the symbolic door of the person is believed to be sacred or is valued in terms of its qualities. No doubt, there are very good reasons for the extraordinary success of the category of a person. A success that seems able to break down even the wall separating analytical and continental philosophy. Very few concepts outside of a person exhibit such a degree of lexical richness, semantic flexibility, and power to evoke. Constituted in the intersection and productive tension between theatrical language, juridical weight, and theological dogma, the concept of a person seems to incorporate a potentiality of meaning so dense and varied as to appear to be something we cannot do without. But another no less important reason should be added. I am speaking of its historical features, which explains the singular growth that the term person undergoes from the middle of the last century onward. It concerns the obvious need after the end of the Second World War to reconstitute that link between reason and body that Nazism had tried to rip apart in its catastrophic attempt to reduce human life to mere biology. This is the intention of the supporters of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, and this is the intention which, focusing on the value and the dignity of the human person, continue to characterize contemporary philosophy, from post-Kantian transcendentalism to Husserlian phenomenology, leaving aside for now the frayed line that runs from Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier to Paul Ricoeur, which urges forward precisely the category of person. More difficult to understand, however, is what effect this increase of personalism has had. Was the category of person able to re-establish that connection which 20th century totalitarianism broke between rights and life in a form that makes possible and effective something like human rights? It's difficult not to answer with a resounding no. A mere glance at today's statistics, read both in absolute and relative terms of those who die every day because of famine, sickness, and war, seemingly give the lie to the very pronouncement of a right to life. Of course, one could easily respond by linking the impracticability of human rights to a question of contingency, to the lack of a power strong enough to impose these rights. One could speak as well of a forceful presence of civilization that has been impervious historically to universal juridical models. In that case, the problem appears to be that our paradigm of person hasn't been extended far enough, or has been extended but only partially. As reassuring as this interpretation might well be, it's useful to set out another point of view that puts into play a more problematic perspective. I think that the notion of person isn't able to join together the epochal hiatus between life and right, between nomos and bios, since it is the notion of a person itself that produces it. In spite of all the self-congratulatory rhetoric of our political rituals, we find that the original efficacy of the paradigm of a person is joined to this production of a hiatus between life and right. There is another preliminary consideration to be made before we take up the question at hand. When we allude to the effect of a concept, which in the case of category of person gestates for very long periods, we find ourselves moving well beyond the strictly categorical definition of the term. Not all concepts produce effects. In very few instances, however, are those effects more numerous than in the case of a person. It means that we are dealing with something quite different from a simple conceptual category. For these reasons, in the title of this paper, I refer to person in terms of dispositive. As is well known, when we speak of dispositive, we are dealing with the concept that Michel Foucault used in the 1960s and which Gilles Deleuze, on the one hand, and Giorgio Agamben more recently, on the other, turned to again in two essays. Both curiously have the same title, What is a Dispositive? It is Agamben who thinks that the root of dispositive can be found in the Christian idea of oikonomia, which the Church Fathers translated with dispositio. It's from them that the term dispositive derives, understood as the administration and the government which God exercises over man in the second person of the Holy Trinity, namely Christ. We can see here the possibility of uncovering a first relation between the functioning of the dispositive and the doubling that is implicit in the idea of a person, in this case divine. Dispositive isn't only what separates being and praxis, ontology and the act of government of God. It is what also allows us to articulate a plurality in the divine unity, which in this specific case has the feature of a trinity. Another key figure deeply associated with that of the Holy Trinity in Christian dogma is the mystery of the Incarnation. It offers the same structure and indeed the same logic of the whole Trinity. Here too, what is at the stake is a unity constituted by a separation. And here too the dispositive allows us to formulate it as such, despite the inversion of roles. If three persons in God are constituted by single substance, Christ unites within his person without mixing them two states or two natures that are substantially different. No less important with respect to the future developments of the paradigm is the fact that these two distinct states or natures that cohabitate in one person are not qualitatively the same, since one is divine and the other human. When we move from the doubled nature of Christ to what makes man a totality composed of soul and body, the qualitative difference between the two elements becomes decisive. Rather than being equal, these elements are actualized in an ordering that layers of superimposes one under the other. Such a hierarchic effect, which is quite clear in St. Augustine, extends to all Christian doctrine, so that there cannot be the least doubt. Although the body isn't in itself something evil, because it too is a divine creation, nevertheless it constitutes the animal part of man. Here too, the Christian idea of person is tied to a unity that isn't only constructed from a doubleness, but is put together in such a way that one of its elements is subordinated to another. This explains how St. Augustine can describe the necessity of meeting man's bodily needs as an illness, in this sense that is the part not properly human in man, the impersonal part of the person. Keeping this perspective in an intricate web of humanization and dehumanization appears in mind, we can see how the dominant role that Foucault bestows on dispositive comes again into play, particularly in its capacity to subjectivize. We know that Foucault never separates this meaning of subjectivity from that of subjection. Only by being subjected to others or to oneself do we become subjects. We also know that for an extremely long period that only concludes with Leibniz at the beginning of the 8th century, what philosophical language understands by object is what we today call object. It's here in the essential distinction between the two figures of subject and object, of subjectivization and subjection, that we find the particular role and function of the dispositive of person. In an essay written with Alain de Libera and Barbara Cassin, Etienne Balibar has reconstructed the genealogy of the concept of subjectivity in its ambivalent relationship with the semantic of subjection. He points out the metaphysical link that ties the philosophical meaning and the juridical function of the category of subject with the Latin term suppositum. A subject, in his etymological meaning, is something or someone placed under himself. Balibar rightly connects this antinomy to the original Roman distinction between personae sui iuris and personae alieni iuris, that is, between persons master of themselves and person belonging to others, but also more important in the concept of person is the distinction that divides the personal subject from a part of himself, not personal, dominated, or related as is a servant. The paradigmatic role of this dispositif is precisely to divide a living being into two natures made up of different qualities, the one subjugated to the mastery of the other, and thus to create a subjectivity through a process of subjection or objectivation. The dispositif of a person makes a part of a body subject to another part, to the degree in which the latter part is the subject of the former. As the Catholic and personalist philosopher Jacques Maritain argues, the human person is, I quote, a totality that is lord over himself and his action, adding that if a healthy conception of politics depends above all on the proper consideration given the human person, it is important to remember that such a person is that of an animal that has the gift of reason, and that the animal part is immense in that measure of reason. Man is a person if and only if he masters the more properly animal part of his nature. Of course, not everyone has this tendency or disposition to de-animalize himself. The degree of humanity present in all will derive from the greater or lesser intensity of this de-animalization, and so too the underlying difference between he who enjoys the full title of a person and he who can enjoy it only if certain conditions have previously been met. Also for Heidegger, we are still thinking of homo animalis, even when anima, soul, is posited as animus sive mens, spirit or mind, and this in turn is posited as subject, person of spirit. I quote Heidegger. It is the Roman juridical codification that systematized in an incredibly powerful fashion the metaphysics of a person. The Roman codification shares with the Christian conception the constitutive nexus of unity and separation, leading the dispositif to its perfect formal completion. Gaius' famous phrase regarding the summa divisio de iure personarum provides the strongest testimony. It prescribes a procedure of separation not only between servi, slaves, and the liberi, free men, but within the latter between ingenui, free men born free, and liberty, those manumitted from legal slavery, and so on, in an unbroken chain of successive doublings. Person is, on the one hand, the more general category since it encompasses the entire human species. On the other hand, it is the prism through which the human species is separated in the hierarchical division between types defined precisely by their constitutive difference. It is thanks to the category of person that human beings are unified in the form of their separation. two elements, unity and separation, are held together and cannot be separated. It's this absolutely obligatory binding that makes possible all the other juridical figures that descend from it. We can already see here an element that will mark the entire history of law, beyond or through its innumerable variations. It concerns the process of inclusion through the exclusion of what isn't included. A category defined in juridical terms, no matter how broad, becomes meaningful only thanks to the comparison and indeed the opposition with another category from which all those are excluded. In juridical language, inclusion only makes sense to the degree to which it marks a limit beyond which there is always someone or something. Outside of this differential logic, a right would never exist as such, but instead would merely constitute a given effect, and therefore it wouldn't even be spoken of as such. Consider in this regard the irresolvable antinomy of so-called natural rights. The aporia of defining an artifice as natural or a fact of nature as artificial. It is precisely the self-contradiction of a similar definition that links the entire juridical edifice to the first invention of Gaius. Leaving aside the different and indeed contradictory formulations, rights in their logical structure remain tied to the form of summa divisio, that is both supremely abstract as well as productive of extraordinarily concrete effects. This isn't because they fail to unite their contents historically, but because in this dispositive, unification logically presupposes separation. The exceptional force of Roman law, understood here in its totality, regardless of how much is changed over time, lies precisely in having founded this dialectic systematically in a fashion that is unparalleled, as its center is the notion of a person, pushed to its limit so as to encompass even what is otherwise declared to be a thing, as in the case of the slave, so that mankind is subdivided into an infinite series of typologies, each of which is awarded different statuses, like fili in potestate, children under the power of the father, uxores in matrimonio, wives taken in marriage, mulieres in manu, subjected women, and so on along an itinerary that gives form to newer and newer divisions. Yet, the terrible legacy of the Roman dispositive of person doesn't lie only in the production of differential thresholds within the mankind, but also in the continual movement between them. The constant presence of exception within the norm and not outside it responds to this demand. For all, the norm constitutes the natural area in which the exception is used, just as the exception expresses not so much the excess or the break as the mechanism by which the norm is recharged. For example, the archaic power of death that the pater enjoys with respect to the filius did not hold if the male child was younger than 3 years of age and was a firstborn. But this exception was in turn superposed through another exception if the child in question was deformed or illegitimate. In such a case, the second exception restored the norm was lost to the first, creating a circuit in which the exception derived from the norm and the norm from the exception. We know how this mechanism culminates today in modern juridical statutes, not only in the sphere of civil law, but also in that of public and even international law. To it is added another mechanism. I am referring to the movement also implicit in the dispositive of the person between the various status states, not only those contiguous in the case of family relations, for instance, but also those more distant, such as the state of servitude and the state of a free man, the latter in its various and multiple gradations. In such a perspective, the two complementary figures of manumissio, freeing of a slave, and emancipatio, enslaving for future emancipation, are shifts in the relation of dependence and domination that some individuals has vis-à-vis others. Therefore, they regulate the mobile threshold of depersonalization, sanctioned most explicitly in the different degrees of diminutio capitis, laws of status, of minima, media, and maxima. Thus, no one in Rome was a full-fledged person from the beginning of life, nor did one remain a person forever. Some became person, as filii became patres. Others were excluded because they were prisoners of war or were debtors. Still others spent their entire lives caught between two poles, as was the case with children who were sold and then made subject to the buyer as well as to the natural father. What is striking here, even more than the absolute clarity of these distinctions, are the zones of indistinction and transition which the first distinction gave rise to their continual movement. If the servile rests are in some way contained within the most generalized form of a person, this means that the category of person encompasses all the intermediate stage of the person over time, of the potential person, as well as the semi-person, up to and including the non-person. It also indicates that the person not only includes within it its own proper negative, but constantly reproduces it. Seen from this perspective, the mechanism of depersonalization is the reverse of personalization and vice versa. It isn't possible to personalize someone without depersonalizing or refining others, without pushing someone into the indefinitive space that opens below the person. Silhouetted against the moving breakdown of the person looms the inert figure of the thing. It's difficult to resist the temptation to connect this dialectic to the modern process of subjectivation and desubjectivation that Foucault connects to how the dispositive functions. No doubt between the two experiences one finds that profound middle ground constituted by the same notion of subject, outside of and irreducible to the Roman juridical conception. Nevertheless, the conceptual and the lexical distance need not cancel out a deeper paradigmatic continuity that belongs to its logical structure, which is embedded in juridical language from the outset. The decisive point of conjunction with modern conception of subjectivity is the separation, found first in the Christian formulation and even more in Roman law, between the category of person and the living being on which it is grafted. The person doesn't coincide with the body in which it inheres, just as the mask is never completely one with actor's face. In this case, as well, the element that most strongly characterizes the machine of the person is to be traced in the subtle interval that always differentiates it from the character that acts, regardless of the qualities of the actor. The same subjective right, which cannot be assimilated to Roman juridical objectivism, carries within it an element that refers precisely to the dispositive of the person. It's in this sense that from the end of the 18th century on, men are declared equal, at least in principle, as subjects of law. The formal separation of different typologies of individuals driven out from the domain of species is transposed, so to speak, within the single individual, which is doubled across two different and layered spheres, one capable of reason and will, and therefore fully human, and the other reduced to biology, practically assimilated to animal nature. While the first, called person, is considered to be the center of juridical imputation, the second, coincides with the body, constitutes a piece or property akin to an internal slave. If in Descartes the distinction between res cogitans et res extensa establishes an unbreakable line of separation between the subject and the body proper, the liberal tradition from Locke to Mill will want to award the mastery of the body to its legitimate owner, to him that inhabits it. Inevitably, they will force the body to cross over it into the domain of the thing. Man is not, but has and possesses his own body, and obviously he can do with it what he will. More striking still is the hierarchical and exclusionary effect that the semantic of the person sets in motion within liberalism itself. I am speaking of authors like Peter Singer and Hugo Engelhardt, who, referring explicitly to Roman law, and in particular to Gaius' formulation, make the distinction between two different categories of man. The first, who can be ascribed fully in the category of person, and the second, who is instead defined only as member of the species of Homo sapiens. Between the two extremes, just as in the jus personarum, we find a series of intermediate steps characterized by a presence of personality which increases or decreases according to the point of view adopted. At its apex, one finds the healthy adult, to whom can be awarded the title of being truly and properly person. Next, there is the infant, who is considered to be a potential person, and then the elderly invalid, who has been reduced to a semi-person, to the terminally ill, to whom the status of non-person is given, to finally the madman, who receives the role of anti-person. The consequence of this classification is subjecting defective person to whole person, who are free to dispose of them as they will on the basis of medical or even economic consideration. As Engelhard, citing Gaius, argues, I quote, just as when we capture a wild animal, a bird or a fish, what we capture becomes ours and is held to belong to us as long as we take care of it. In the same way, when we speak of deformed children or of a terminally ill, so too we are this subject to the power of those persons who are free to decide whether to keep them alive or to ease them on their way towards death. Without wanting to make events and concepts equivalent that are both distant in their origin and their aims, such as that of ancient Rome and those periods closer to us, the unavoidable impression is that today we find ourselves facing something that goes well beyond a simple analogy, and which suggests a kind of a repetition, a remnant that isn't subject to historical transformation and that is reproduced again and again, even if the context is completely different. The hypothesis implicit in what I've said to this point is that the past, or at least some of its most important figures, such as that of person, return thanks to their untimeliness, that is, thanks to their anachronistic features. No doubt, if we are to grasp this non-historical or hyper-historical element that cuts across and destabilizes what we usually refer to as history, we need to adopt an oblique sagittal gaze that supersedes both the linear historicism of history of ideas as well as a programmatic Heideggerian anti-historicism. Reinhard Koselleck's notion of the co-presence of different times in one time is closer to the kind of perspective I have in mind. Clearly, though, its more proper antecedent can be traced in Nietzsche's genealogy, in Foucault's archaeology, as well as in Benjamin's entire project, when he, especially in his book on Paris, attempts to locate those original fragments buried deep in the earth of modernity. In all of these paradigms, there emerges, albeit differently, the same rejection of the clear-cut alternative between continuity and discontinuity, between belonging and not belonging. What is most distant from us is the hidden center of the familiar, such that the archaic is so often profoundly connected to the contemporary world that it constitutes its most conspicuous feature. As I already noted, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that what we can define as the resurgence of the archaic in the present functions not because of the proximity of a consecutive temporal segment, but rather because of the distance between these segments. In other words, it is distance triggered by what has been called the futurization of history that opens up in the flux of time those empty spaces, those fractures, and those crevasses in which the archaic can once again re-emerge. Not, of course, as a living body of history, but rather as a spectre, a phantasm that awakens or is reawakened by the sorcerer who happens to be on duty at the time. Awakened, we should add, and often by its own absolute negation. As Freud showed, it is the rejection, the repression, and the abandonment of something that provokes its phantasmatic return, and which it a potentially lethal effect. More than one example of something dead and buried returning with deadly results can be found. Consider the case of sovereign power, understood especially in its military dimension within the current biopolitical regime, where the spectral or, if you prefer, the mystical element lies in the fact that it returns with symmetrical but opposite characteristic with reference to how it was originally configured. Where classical sovereignty consisted essentially in the power of making the law, today's sovereignty of the biopolitical variety is specifically marked by the opposite, in deactivating it, constantly transforming the exception into the norm and the norm into the exception. This isn't so different from what happened with respect to the ancient Roman dispositif. Another example, just as spectral, of the re-emergence of the archaic can be found today in the return to the local as well as to the ethnic within an already globalized world, which takes place, as many have argued, not in opposition to, but as a function of the very same process of globalization. The more globalization acts as a form of generalized contamination between environments, experiences, and different languages, the more it sets in motion the phenomena of immunitarian rejection through the defensive as well as offensive claims for one's own particular identity. Doesn't the revival of a religion in our secularized world, a religion so often characterized by the shedding of blood, present itself as resurgent of the originary within hypermodernization? Earlier I referred to Nietzsche, Benjamin, and Foucault, but Simone Weil is really the author who, more than any other and with more force and originality, attempted to locate the archaic in the present, or the present in the archaic. Reading her essays on the origins of Hitlerism that focus on parallels with ancient Rome provides us with the most stunning kind of proof. Foregoing the typical view of history, Weil offers another way of looking at things that I described earlier as oblique and sagittal, one that is capable of doubling or dividing what is seen into the two intersecting levels. From one side, what at the first glance appears an unacceptable anachronism emerges instead as the only way of registering the recurring phenomenon of the re-emergence of the originally, the time that had intended to leave it behind. At its center is situated a constitutive relation between transformation and permanence that turns one into the antinomical reverse of the other. This is something Simone Weil maintains from the outset. Thanks to her, we see how the rhetoric of a racial continuity that the Nazis perfected gives way to a diagonal relation that breaks apart and then overlays different times and spaces. Racial prejudice, however unconscious, has the effect of closing our eyes, I am quoting Simone Weil, to what is clearly true, that what Hitler's Germany resembled isn't the Germany's of 2,000 years ago, but Rome. Rather than speaking of a resemblance, however, we should speak of a sudden eruption of something that appeared dead and instead was merely asleep, waiting for a tear in historical time to appear out with uncontrollable fury. Weil reconstruct its specific traits with precision, indeed with stubbornness, the terror it provokes in victims, the systematic deceit, the methodical construction of an unlimited domination that allows an interpretative choice that cannot be negotiated because it is rooted in what for Weil is an absolute belief. Even more surprising, perhaps, is that these deadly features aren't just opposed, but are seen as intrinsic to what has been defined as the invention of rights in the West. This is exactly the point of Weil's genealogy, praising ancient Rome for having given to us the notion of right, she writes, is absolutely scandalous, because if one wants to analyze what it was originally so as to determine its type, one sees that property was defined first with the right of using and abusing in mind, and essentially the greatest part of those things which every proprietor has the right to use and abuse are human beings. If we look back to that origin most distant from us, what comes into view is the bare facticity of appropriation. According to Weil, the bridge between Roman law and violence is constituted by property. Owning things and man transformed into things through the institution of slavery constitutes not only the contest of juridical order, but its very form. Here, at the center of an analysis of Nazis, the refined effect of that logical juridical dispositif re-emerges, which, having divided human beings into free men and slaves, places between them a zone of indistinction that winds up superimposing them, making the free man the equivalent of a slave. Yet, the more pertinent element here, one that Weil also draws our attention to, is how the dispositif that functions via exclusion is joined to the category of the person. I quote, "The notion of rights no doubt drags with it thanks to its own mediocrity, that of the person, because rights are related to personal things. They are situated at that level. Well, address this attack not only at the primacy of rights over duties, which is to say a subjectivist and individual conception of justice, but at the division that such a category presupposes or produces within the unity of the living being. The same idea which today has spread to the four corners of the globe of the sacredness of human person function precisely by leaving behind or expelling what in man is not judged to be personal and what therefore can be violated without worry. I quote, "I see a passerby in the streets. He has long arms, blue eyes, and a mind whose thoughts I don't know, but perhaps they are commonplace. If it were the human personality in him that was sacred to me, I could easily put out his eyes. As a blind man, he would be exactly as much a human personality as before. I should have destroyed nothing but his eyes." More than anyone else, Weil sets out with remarkable clarity the dehumanizing function of the mask of the person. Once the mask is made safe, it doesn't matter what happens to the face on which it rests, and even less to the faces that don't own masks. To those who still aren't persons, or who no longer are persons, or to those who were never declared to be persons. It is the absolute lucidness of this point of view, one ignored by all the personalism of yesterday and today, precisely because it changes a platitude, that pushes Weil toward the impersonal. When soon after she writes that so far from its being his person, what is sacred in human being is the impersonal in him, everything which is impersonal in man is sacred and nothing else, she inaugurates a path, no doubt difficult and complex, whose importance we are able to discern only today. Even more, it suggests the possibility, and one again largely ignored today, of profoundly changing our philosophical, juridical, and political lexicon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your kindness.